You're listening to a podcast by Great Kids. To learn more about us, visit our website at greatkidsinc.org.
This is Different Eyes, the view from the heart of another, a Great Kids podcast about overcoming bias in others and in ourselves. We'll be talking about how we can learn to see what others see, and vice versa, helping others see what we see. Our discussions will revolve around bias, cognitive bias and implicit bias, and how this all relates to the work that you do to support families. Looking back over the past year has proven interesting in so many ways. One day, our reflections evolved into a discussion of cognitive bias and all the ways that this affects decision-making, ours and everyone else's, without us even realizing it. The conversation got interesting enough that it sparked the idea for this podcast. We hope that by beginning to look through the eyes of others and also helping them to see what we see, we might all start to see things that maybe without each other's help, we never would have noticed. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 4. Today we're going to be talking about Naïve Realism. As usual, Shauna Donaldson, the Executive Director of Great Kids, is my partner in this cognitive bias exploration adventure. If you haven't been listening in on previous episodes, what we're doing is we're using this platform for the next few months to talk about cognitive bias and how it relates to our lives, and even more specifically, the field of home visiting.
Yeah. If you haven't joined us before, we are defining cognitive bias as a systematic error in thinking that happens due to the need for our brain to simplify information so it can be processed quickly.
Yeah. I mean, quickly making sense of the world can be a lifesaver, but these shortcuts can also lead to mistakes in our decision making, mistakes that can negatively impact our lives and really the lives of others.
Yeah. Being human means having cognitive bias, and this can't be avoided completely. But talking about them as we are today and as we have been over the last few podcasts is an essential first step to preventing this kind of thinking from getting us into problems.
Right. With these this series of podcasts that we're working on, we're working to understand how our brains make inaccurate evaluations of ourselves and of other people. We're hoping that with these conversations, we can all begin to see through the eyes of others and understand how they've come to the conclusions that they have about the world.
Yeah. So far in our previous episodes, we've discussed confirmation bias, the bandwagon effect, and fundamental attribution error. And as Dana said, this episode is going to be all about naive realism. So Dana, how about you help us understand a little bit more about this one?
Yeah, so the name's probably unfamiliar. I don't think the feeling or the thing is going to be unfamiliar as we start to talk about it. I think everyone will probably recognize it. Naive realism is our tendency to believe that we see the world, or the way that we see the world is as it really is. We believe that our perception of the world is completely objective and unbiased. How naive of us to believe that everything we perceive is real, which is exactly where the name comes from for this one. When you first think about that, it seems innocent enough, right? Like, we perceive the world, that's how the world is. But there are a couple of problems that can arise from this sort of thinking. The first one is that it leads us to believe that other rational people will see things the same way we do.
Yeah. And then from there, I can see where we can get ourselves into even more trouble.
Yeah.
Maybe this is the second thing that you're really getting to, is that our conclusion will end up being that when other people have perceptions that are different from us, they must be uninformed, irrational, and just plain wrong.
Right. Okay. So for an example, I have to go back to the dress that was making the rounds on social media a few years ago. I think you know the one I mean, right? The dress that broke the internet. Remember?
Yeah, I think we all did it, right? It challenged us to all figure out what color the dress was. And I think it ended up that there was basically two sets of colors that people seemed to see in that picture. Do you remember what color you saw?
Yeah, I think for me it was blue and black. What about you?
Yeah, that was the color I saw as well. But I know a lot of people who saw it, I think it was gold was the other color.
Yeah, right. I think like gold and white or something like that, right? Yeah. So Naïve Realism says that we would believe that however we saw it was how it really was. And I don't know about you, but I really did believe quite strongly that it was blue and black, and that everyone who saw it differently might have something wrong with their vision, or they were color confused or something, right? It was just hard to believe that other people weren't seeing what I saw.
Yeah. And of course, they thought the same thing about you.
Right? Because we all believe that what we see is real. We don't usually think of our perceptions as being subjective. And I think it's an important point for Naïve Realism is that we understand that people are seldom, if ever, aware of the degree to which we could be wrong, right? We feel very strongly that that our judgments are much more accurate, objective, and realistic than they really are.
Yeah,
I think the gold and white seers, right? Like they probably strongly believed that I was wrong, or maybe even irrational, at least about the dress, anyway. And I guess about the dress color, it doesn't really matter. But what about when it's something that matters a lot more to us? That's when it can really start to cause problems in our relationships.
Yeah. And, the dress example is pretty harmless. We could all disagree and laugh about that dress and get along just fine, you know. Right. But the problem is that our way of thinking is not limited to things just like that. We all do the same thing with social reality as well. Not only do we have a tendency to believe that what we see is right, but we also believe that what we think is the right way to think too.
Let's try to use an example from the world of home visiting. Yeah. Have you got an example that might bring this home for us in a little bit different way?
Yeah, I think so. As I thought about this, I started thinking about tantrums and toddlers, right?
Yeah.
A home visitor working with a couple of young parents, right? And maybe one of those parents saw tantrums in their toddler as a way of manipulating the parents, right? They saw the child as being spoiled, in need of punishment during these tantrum episodes. But the other partner saw something very different. They felt like the child was asking for help to deal with some big emotions, and they wanted to provide nurturing instead of punishment.
Yeah, that's a hard place for a parenting couple to be in, right? They saw exactly the same situation, the exact same child, in two very different ways, right? But they really needed to come together to decide on a parenting plan that they could use during these times so that they would be consistent in their ways of dealing with the child.
Right. And so based on what the home visitor knew from our curriculum, it would have been very easy to take sides in this parenting struggle. Yeah. Because the home visitor knew what the research says about tantrums and what children are really trying to communicate there. But the home visitor had wonderful self-awareness that she knew that approach of taking a side would not be the most effective way to support these parents with moving forward and supporting their child. And so what she decided to do was to support them with maybe refocusing a bit. And she started by having them go over their What I Want for My Child activity during the visit. And by doing this, right, the parents were able to see how they were both really in sync on their vision of their future for their child, right? So she created some alignment in what they really wanted for their child.
Yeah, that's so smart, right? That actually brings us back to what we've said before about seeing similarities in the people who we don't agree with or who don't agree with us. It's such a great strategy for helping them to see their similar goals and values as parenting partners. So what was the next step?
Yeah. So the home visitor hadn't listened to this podcast yet. So, right, she wasn't thinking about the viewpoint of cognitive bias. But what she did know was that helping them to hear each other out with open minds would help them show up in a place of curiosity instead of a place of judgment. And I know that they worked on this a lot. We know that in the field of home visiting, this is a common challenge or opportunity for all of us. There was no immediate happy ending in this particular home visiting scenario, but ultimately by having the parents listen to each other and remaining open to the research, the home visitor supported them to find and explore. These parents were able to create some policies for themselves about how they were going to handle tantrums in a way that supported the toddler's growth and ability to self-regulate, right? And she was able to do that because they knew the parents were aligned in what they wanted for their child.
Yeah, so good. And I'm glad there was eventually a happy ending for this one. Do you think that if she had understood maybe a little bit more about cognitive bias, that would have been a helpful conversation to have with the parents?
Right. I think so. We keep saying that understanding that we all have some of these cognitive biases is the first step to overcoming them. So I do think it would have helped them in this process, just as our conversations, Dana, about the different biases has helped me be more thoughtful and reflective. So, if parents could have understood that we all have this naive reality bias, maybe they could have opened up more quickly to the possibility that each other's perceptions might not be completely wrong.
Right. Maybe eventually we need to write up some conversation guides around cognitive bias, right? Mm-hmm. But seriously, having conversations these kinds of conversations that we are on this podcast really supports the home visitor to support mm-hmm. parents with understanding of this topic. And I think that's a good start.
Yeah, you're right. Understanding is key. One of the problems with naive realism is that it causes us to believe that we all see the world in the same way, but that just isn't true. In reality, we all interpret the world differently based on our perspective, who we are, and how we got here.
Yeah. I think the fact of the matter is we've all had different experiences. We grew up differently. We have different memories, different values, different hopes and dreams for the future. Mm-hmm. And that means we're going to interpret the world differently. One of my favorite writers says it this way. Well, actually, he says it in Latin first, which I'm not going to attempt to do. But basically, what it translates to is whatever is received according to the manner of the receiver. Mm. So in other words, we don't see things as they are. We see things as we are.
Dana, when you shared this quote with me, I told you, I said, I love this. I need to put this on my computer so I stay connected to it because it is so true, isn't it?
Yeah, I know, right? I wish I had learned this years ago. Mm-hmm. Even though we tend to believe that all rational people will think the same way that we do or will think like we do, the world is really much more ambiguous than that. It's never that cut and dry. We have to be able to disagree or see things differently without feeling those strong emotions that often arise in those situations.
It's so true. Dissent can be a good thing. It's actually a great thing, and we have to allow space for that. If we surround ourselves only with people who think like we do, we will remain close to all other possibilities and maybe miss out on some really great perspectives. Yeah. So just like with the parents in our example, the only way forward in these kinds of situations is to understand that the other person came to their beliefs with a line of reasoning just like we did.
Yeah. It's so important to remember back to our tribal nature. Our need to connect and to belong is very, very strong, right? If we start there, we can use that to come together.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want to disagree, right? We just do because we're seeing the world differently. Remembering that seems to me to be an important part of this process, the process of reconciling our differences.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think you brought us back to where we always seem to land in these conversations, which really is empathy. If we don't start with empathy and understanding, we can quickly end up in a place where we hit a roadblock and we can't move forward together.
Yeah. And if both people continue to see the other person as irrational and biased, they will likely never get to a resolution that works for both of them. So what do? How do we overcome this naive reality bias?
Yeah. You know, this is always the hard part, right? I think it starts, as always, with understanding. You know, understanding first ourselves,
Right.
and the fact that naive realism is the default system in our brain. And that means it's very powerful. Remember last episode when we talked about the elephant, right?
Yeah.
The elephant jumps into action immediately. So in order to give our rider a chance to catch up and control the situation a bit, it's like we said before, slowing down is going to be important.
So our automatic thinking can be overcome if we activate our intentional system. And that will allow us to see situations in different lights.
Yeah. And most importantly, it leads us to the path of increased empathy, right? And so maybe when we find ourselves in one of these situations where we think the other person's opinion is wrong, and we will, right, frequently. So there's lots of opportunities for us to practice this one. We just slow down enough to stop for a minute and see through the eyes and the heart of the other person so that we can understand their thought processes just a little bit better.
Mm-hmm. You know, Dana, as we talk about this theme of empathy and staying in a place of empathy, it's just crucial we remember that. And I love how we keep anchoring back to seeing through the eyes and heart of another, because that is real empathy. You know, the best way to understand that the other person's, I'm going to say that again, the best way to understand what the other person's thought processes are is to really listen to them. And it's using that open mind, open heart that really allows us to hear them.
Yeah, I think, you know, when we listen, you know, one of the things that I think we've talked about in the past is this idea that when we listen, don't just listen to the words, but listen to the feelings that are creating those words. What's behind the words? How is this person really feeling so that you can connect with them on that level? So empathy, right? You know, and I think perhaps that's an excellent place for us to end our conversation today. I like that we end with empathy. That always feels complete to me. I think empathy is the perfect starting and ending point for most things.
Yeah. Dana, I've enjoyed our time together today, and we're so grateful to have everybody else join us as we work through these conversations. And hopefully we'll all get back together again in a couple of weeks as we explore another one of our cognitive biases.
Yeah. Until then, just remember that the world that you see through your eyes is not necessarily the same world that others see. So try to see through the eyes and hearts of others whenever you can. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.